especially to those of you who are joining us from outside the journalism school. We're very happy to have you. Our speaker today is kicking off the season, or the series, Betty Winfield, who is a curator's professor at the University of Missouri. She is in the School of Journalism at Missouri and also holds an appointment in the political science department there. Betty does quite a bit of work in uses of history in media coverage. She also researches the area of political communication. I was fortunate to be her student, both for my master's program and my PhD program at Missouri, and got to co-author a piece there with her on uses of history in coverage of September 11 in U.S. and U.K. papers. Today, Betty will talk about reputation building in as it relates to the Court of Discovery, Lewis and Clark's Court of Discovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. William Faulkner, I have to give you a Southern writer. William Faulkner said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And so in news, I'm saying the past is never dead. It's not even past. In fact, a very famous French scholar by the name of Herr Nora said the past never passes. Those who linger past, they're just linger on the scene, even as newcomers crowd their way in. And actually, that's kind of like news. It's never past, it just keeps accumulating. And think about this, journalists seek news. They seek the new. They seek the new, but it's not enough. The facts are not enough. They have to have something with it. And so if the facts are not enough, the past comes in as context and as a different comparison, as analogies, as values, in a number of different ways. And so particular past and particular memories are called up in the news, and they emerge, and they become legitimatized, and they settle as part of our nation's history. I seek that process. I want to look at how that happens, not only in the content, but what the process is to make that happen. Because I seek the process of emerging and becoming settled in how it evolves and relates to making, for instance, reputations. In other words, it has some effect. It has some results. Wait a minute. Stand. Okay. The process of using the past. What does it do? Does it make reputations? What does it do in the big picture? So today I have this ambitious goal. My ambitious goal is to talk about uses of history and give you recent examples that in the news and make you more aware of it, hopefully. Secondly, to talk about the previous studies that I've done, mostly with our PhD students. And then I hope to raise in your mind possibilities for your own research. And then lastly, I want to talk about my current research here at the University of North Carolina, where I'm looking at the evolving uses of the past and historical references in making a reputation, individual reputations and group reputations. This first slide, those are two images of Cleo, goddess of history, in case you know, just to make sure you know. Okay, the Greek one, and it's been there. And then there's a 20th century image of Lewis and Clark. And the reason I know it's 20th century is because the previous images of Sacagawea didn't have her pointing. So we know by the 20th century she's pointing to the right. So let me point that out. Let me talk about a little bit more. Let's see what I get. Oh, here it is. About maybe I'll talk a little bit more. There it is, assumptions about the journalistic use of historical references, okay? And I mentioned news is new, yet history gives us the when. And maybe it gives us the how and the why. And I think what's important about this is that we understand that what news is. And you study it, you're scholars in it, you pay a lot of attention to it. It's more than just the factual news the objective description of those events, but it's part of the culture, Jim Carrey told us. It's part of the power structure, Michael Schützen told us. It's part of propaganda and nationalism, actually, that Koch told us. So we need aspects beyond just the simple facts. Carey argued that the weakness of American journalism was it gives us thin slices, fragmentations, and we have to put it together. We have to read lots of different stories to put it together. Thanks. I get something. Okay. And so we have to look at separate stories to have a coherent whole of what is really happening, because each story starts anew. Each story starts anew each day as if no one had previously heard of the subject before. Historical context may help, and the story then becomes more explanatory, more analytical, with counter views and motives and context if we use historical references. Think about the Hutchins Commission. Some 63 years ago gave a directive to journalists. And the directive was this: give a truthful, comprehensive, and intelligent account of the day's events in a context that gives them meaning. It's that context that becomes important. It's that context that can use history. So the ways we use history, but it tells us about ourselves as a nation. We've had lots of studies on that. But history can be useful in numerous ways. One of my favorite books on this, and I discovered this when I was a fellow at the Shorenstein Center at Kennedy School, was Ernest K. Nebe and Richard Newstead taught a course for beginning bureaucrats. And they wrote a book called Thinking in Time. And they talked about how bureaucrats use history, either erroneously or correctly. And they gave them case studies on this. And the ways that bureaucrats use history, and I think this is useful for journalists, as context, we already talked about that, but to place people, to place a person, their own personal history, and how that history relates to the culture and the events of their time and the people they knew. For comparisons, to compare this time with another time, or this person with a previous historical person. For remembrances, like we just had this past weekend, for nostalgia we call that, and certainly for values and lessons. So we know that, okay? Let's look also. Cartoonists use history. This is one of my favorites. David Horsey, who is at the now web-based Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Horsey won the Pulitzer Prize twice. And because he was a student when I was a PhD student at Washington, I know he had to take mass media history as an undergrad. And I also know that he took other history courses. I know this from reading him. And look at how he used history in this cartoon, okay? He took one time, another time, and another time to make an argument, to make a point about the government oversight. And I thought he used it very cleverly. He had to know what was going on in those other time periods and how that relates. Also, not just cartoonists, but others use history. And so I'm going to escape here and show you some examples because I think they're useful for us to understand. I'm going to have to escape. Let's see if we can do this. Bear with me a minute. Okay, here it is. This was in the New York Times over the weekend. Hold up. It's coming. I think it's coming. One use of history. This is a personal use of history about an individual. Perhaps you saw it this weekend, front page story, about the 9/11 families. One last holdout remains. This is one family that refuses to take the money, they want a court case. They want a court case, they're suing Boeing and I believe it's United Airlines, because their son, Mark Davis, was a passenger on the airline that came from Boston and struck on the second tower. And this, now notice how history is used. Ever since 2002, the family has filed a suit, and what happened. And here are the reasons. Here's what the brother said. Here's what the lawyers said, okay, about it, and why, what they're going after. And here's what the lawyer is arguing, the security breaches of that day, okay, and so forth. So here, history is used as a placement of this lawsuit. We've had that a lot of times with court cases. And so then what was this young man like? What was Mark like? Well, he was a big hockey fan. He played ice hockey. His brother, with his brother, both at Boston U, and then he became a coach. His brother's an assistant coach at Boston U, and he was a coach at Brown and Harvard. So forth, we really get placement of this person, and we get with history. Look at this next one, another front page story from the New York Times this weekend, using history is used. And this one, the Muslims in the Twin Towers, the some 60 Muslims who were there, and how, now this was new for me, maybe it was new for you, and it used history on how that was set up to have a prayer room, okay, on the 17th floor in the South Tower. In other words, how this came about, what happened to do this. And then here is not only a placement, but a recollection of this particular individual, Adus Salam, and why, and where, how he was involved in trying to get a prayer place, and who came, and then on 9/11, how he went out to the meeting place on Broadway, and Bessie, and he never saw those prayer-seeking people. He watched it collapse. And so now, I mean, notice this was very selective. Notice the timing on this with the controversy over the mosque in Lower Manhattan near the Twin Towers. So that was another one. Here's one more. I'll show you this one. How history is used. This one is about a family in which the husband died. He was in Windows of the World. He worked in the kitchen here. The family hadn't been here in this country more than 4 years. And here is what has happened to the family, what happened then, okay, and what happens with the wife now, and then what happened that day, and her viewpoint and how she survived it. So placement, using history as placement of an individual in a timely way on what else is going on. Certainly that was done. I'm not going to play President Obama at the Pentagon. I'm sure you probably saw that on the news, but I don't know how many of you saw. Let me just play this one with Laura Bush. Both First Ladies spoke out at Shanksville. And let me just play a little bit of this. Get this up. Can't hear it, can you? Get this up. We can get it louder. Fortunately, Laura Bush hadn't spoken yet. I want you to notice when Laura Bush speaks how she uses "I was there," the witness. I was there. Here's what I saw. Okay.
Bush. This is not her first time here at the site. In the days immediately following September the 11th, Mrs. Bush was here. She came to pay her respects and to grieve with those that lost their loved ones. During a time of unspeakable tragedy, Mrs. Bush brought some calm and comfort to those that she visited with and those that watched from around the nation. Each time that Mrs. Bush has come back to this place, her grace and compassion have been felt by all that have been with her. She is a lifelong lover of our national parks, and her presence here at one of our nation's newest national parks helps to convey the importance of this place. Please join me in warmly welcoming Mrs. Laura Bush of this field. And then thank you for your good work here for the National Park System, and especially for this Flight 93 memorial. I'm honored to mark this day with the families of Flight 93. And I'm happy to be here with the First Lady who serves our country with such grace. Thank you, Governor Rendell and Secretary Salazar, for your good words. And thank you, Gordy, for representing the families that I'm looking at before me. When I was first here on September 17th, 2001, this quiet field was scarred by a smoldering crater. Our grief was raw, and our heartache was heavy. We were just learning the names of those aboard Flight 93 and the story of their sacrifice. This peaceful place was not chosen by the terrorists. They had other targets for their violence and hate. This spot was chosen by the passengers of Flight 93, who spared our country from even greater horrors. As we gather to remember those who were lost and honor their courage, we are deeply grateful. The events of September 11th grow distant in time, but they remain vivid in the memory of our nation and in the hearts of those who suffered such a great loss. Over the years, we've learned the stories of those last minutes aboard Flight 93. Passengers placed calls to authorities to warn them of the hijacking. We know they call family members to assure them of their love and to tell them of their plans. One passenger called his wife and said, "I know we're all going to die. There's 3 of us who are going to do something about it. I love you, honey." And we know that in the midst of their fear, they were calmed by their faith.
Okay, stop there. So, I was there. Commemorations and anniversaries are very much part of our lives. In fact, there's a wrote about that. How we commemorate, it's not just 4th of July, but other anniversaries. And certainly that goes back to the 19th century when states became states, not territories, and they celebrated year after year. They celebrated George Washington's birthday, they celebrated numerous things. Let's move on and look at it locally, okay? Let's go beyond this and let's look at one more New York Times story. This I find interesting because it's placing John Boehner, who may be our next Speaker of the House. Maybe you saw this in Sunday New York Times with Lobbyist, okay? And historically, how they placed him, okay? Notice down here, don't get down until we get into the article, and it starts talking about Boehner's particular ties and the monies, okay? And then his hope, and then here. Okay, now notice the comparison. Not as fiery as Newt Gingrich, or as unrelenting and arm twister as Tom DeLay. Notice the comparisons here. Notice previous figures in placing John Boehner, okay? And then, let's look at this next page. We talked about him and the troubles he's gotten into over lobbying national headlines in 1996. Maybe some of you remember when he was caught handing out checks from tobacco lobbyists to fellow Republicans on the House. And his business-friendly actions Here's the workforce committee, started in 2006. Here are his circle of friends, and then he's certainly gotten in trouble over, going to fancy hotels paid for by lobbyists. Look right here, 2000 to 2007, he flew at least 45 times, often with his wife on corporate jets. So placing with past events. You see that a lot in political stories, on political features, personality profiles, and so forth. In this case, I thought it was pretty interesting. Front page New York Times. We'll talk about bias later, but anyway, front page New York Times in this particular story. Now let's look here in North Carolina. Okay, let's look at the news that was this past week. This is certainly on the North Carolina Supreme Court considering third-party rules. Let's look at that just a second. And only a slight mention of history, but I think it's in 1 minute and 2 seconds.
The Democratic Party doesn't, and the Republican Party, they just do not fit my views.
Getting a political party on a North Carolina ballot requires tens of thousands of signatures. In front of the state's highest court, lawyers argued that is unfair and unconstitutional.
You have history that says that 10,000 votes was enough for 50 years, then clearly 84,000 votes, which is now a requirement, is way more than you need.
Lawyers for the state argued they have to plan for what could happen if more parties are allowed to submit candidates for all 10 of the statewide elected offices. If the court overturns the law, just 5 different parties could bring as many as 50 candidates in one election cycle. And that doesn't include local races.
So if there are too many offices on the ballot, they won't all fit on the card. You have to turn it over. That's always bad.
Being a recognized political party allows groups more flexibility to raise money and hold primaries, but voters we talked to were split.
There are more parties. I mean, sometimes there are independents on it. So I think it's fine.
Why you need to have 80,000 people in signature to represent a segment of the population. If they want to run, allow them to run.
Supporters of the third parties are hopeful, but in all of the lower courts, the judges ruled in favor of the state. In Raleigh, Kendall Jones, NBC 17 News.
Okay, let's stop there. So, snippets of history. What happened 10 years ago in this particular topic? What happened legally before the previous court cases? You see that a lot. Now, lastly, locally, I'd like to look at my first notice of the football scandal. Okay. In UNC sport troubles may go back a year or more. Here is, this story was on Friday, and it points out the tutoring problem. Unlike the local paper, the Tar Heel, which told us the tutoring problem and got into the tutoring problem before, this story doesn't. It just mentions this was a potential problem before. And so when I was reading it, I was looking for the history. I wanted to know if this coach had other problems with NCAA. I wanted to know, this was just popping up in my head. I really wanted to know if North Carolina has had more than one problem with NCAA and violations, and if so, was it over tutoring, recruiting, or work, or money, or whatever. Certainly my university's had its share of NCAA problems. So I was really looking for that, and I didn't really see that in this story. Only one reference to previous tutoring problems, but no explanation. And as I mentioned, the Tar Heel did get into that. So the need of history, I think, becomes really, really important. And I think it's important to go there. Okay. Now, what's happened in the news a lot, especially since Obama came in and we had this great recession today, and so analogies are looked back to the Great Depression of the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt as president. And so we've had that kind of comparison over and over. And some of it is a good comparison, others I think they're making mistakes. But this particular cartoon, another one of Horsey's cartoons, actually, look at the date on that, February the 1st, 2009. The president hadn't been in office for 10 days, okay? And here is, this is good for us to see, that this is the bipartisanship attempt. And then notice the kind of words used, the kind of references used to Hoover, to socialists. and then Obama's reaction. So I think the use of history, again, to make a point. Now, if you do two people from different time periods, the first thing you do is look for likenesses and differences. And if you look at likenesses between Franklin Roosevelt and Obama, both were elected during crises, economic global crises. Both tried to shore up the capitalistic system. Both had high unemployment. Actually, Roosevelt had 25% unemployment in 1933. Both had failing banks. Actually, Roosevelt had 1 out of every 4 banks. I mean, it's horrible from everything I've read. And both could communicate well from whatever means of communication they had. Both had worldwide security crises. Both had vicious critics. Now, what's different? You know, you look at likenesses, you look at differences from the use history. The extent of the bank failures and unemployment. The changes in the mass media. Look at the tremendous variety of mass media we have today, because in 1933, what did we have? We had radio, we had photojournalism, we had newsreels, we had print media. That's it. So, I mean, the dealing with different mass media was certainly a big difference from yesterday to today. And the party ratio was different in Congress. Roosevelt had a majority, actually, the whole time he was in Congress. He had a Democratic majority. Greater ones like when he came in 33, and real tough races like in 38 with Congress, midterm congressional elections. We had fascism then versus terrorism today. We had broadcast critics today who set the terms of the debate. We had the print media critics primarily then. We had a Father Coughlin, a critic. We had a Dr. Townsend, who's a critic in the 30s, but they didn't have the impact of Lindbeck or Rush Limbaugh. We had the impact of lobbyists today. We didn't have that then, okay? And we had public hope, a real hope. I'm thinking a lot about that lately, about the differences in personalities between Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama. Because there was tremendous public hope. We can do something about this. We can survive this. And belief in change certainly is a difference then. What else? We also place and we compare the Afghan War with the Vietnam War. Have you heard that? Over and over. But look at these. Here's a cartoon by Carlson. You know, the placement of the Afghan War with the Soviet Union, the Great Britain, rest in peace, and here's a U.S. soldier. Okay, in other words, other countries have gone there to try to fight. I don't know if you can see that one very well, but it says, know yourself, know your enemy, above all, know the terrain. And then it says, get out of Afghanistan, let's get out of USSR, go home, death to the British Empire. So, I mean, these are failures. This is a warning in this cartoon. But look here when we compare the Afghan War with the Vietnam War. Likenesses, porous borders, okay, unstable, unfriendly neighbors, corrupt and questionable legitimate government in both cases, unlikelihood of success in both cases, terrible impact on civilian population. Well, what's different? In 9 years versus 11 years of involvement, we had over 5,000 American dead now, over 58,000, certainly then. And the cost, tremendous cost differences. So one way to use history is to think about the likenesses and differences in the ways that you use it, and to outline those, to put those out and see how they are. Now, next I want to talk about, Next I want to talk about some of the research I've done. Barbara mentioned some of them. This one I did with Janice Hume, who was a PhD student of mine and is now in Georgia. It took us 10 years on this thing because nobody would publish it. They thought we were crazy doing this. Well, it won a national award when it was finally published. So my lesson to you is don't give up. If you believe in something, just hang in there. But we looked at the historical references in 19th century journalism, primarily magazines. We did take the New York Times, and we took 3 months from the time the Times started in 51 all the way up to the 20th century. And what we did is we looked at how history was used. What ways was it used? And we thought this was important because we didn't have much history in the early 19th century. We didn't have professional historians. We had very few U.S. magazines that lasted more than a couple of issues. We were dependent upon British magazines. And so we saw this as a way to see evolution and change over time with the rise of magazines, with the rise of history being appreciated and happening and events being recorded. And so we were looking at, with the timing of the 20th century, we looked and actually saw the usefulness of reinforcing the past and nation building. And we saw actually historical continuity and repeated national core, this optimism, this manifest destiny that comes out by the 1830s in the press. We saw that as part of that continuity. We saw the coverage as making the country aware of history. And some of these early historians in this country wrote for magazines. They were editors of magazines. Adams family being primarily one. And we found that there was more of a reliance on historical references with the rise of feature stories. We had the rise of feature stories in the 19th century. And the most used historical reference happened to be context, trying to place an event with its roots, or place people with their roots. And then, of course, these nostalgic events like that I talked about a while ago with 9/11, but the nostalgic events in the 19th century of the anniversaries. Lafayette returned. Huge celebrations. The Lafayette returned in the late 1820s. Celebrations all over the country because it was a nostalgia for when the Revolutionary War went on. Okay? And then from 1870 on, the constant reference to the Civil War. This person was a drummer, a drum boy for Jeb Stuart. So he gets a picture, okay? This person dressed up like a soldier as a female. She was a soldier in some infantry group. And so it tells you that kind of, I was there, and I want to tell my story before I die. Those kind of features were in these magazines. What did we do here? Now, we looked at 2,000 stories. 2,000 magazine stories. We used Poole's Index, we used Reader's Guide to periodicals. But we actually looked at the stacked headlines. Hazel Dick and Garcia points out that stacked headlines give you the gist of a story. And while it's not perfect and it doesn't have the precision that we might like, at least we could see patterns, and that's what we were looking at. So we looked at stacked headlines to see what types of history happen to be used. And this is what we found. It's in Journalism, Mass Communication, Monograph. Anybody wants to read it? It's in your library. Pass that on. So let me show a couple of other studies. We did several other content studies. This one's one Barbara, the first one here on the left, that Barbara was talking about. History as metaphor through which the current world is viewed. British and American newspapers use history to explain September the 11th, and it came out in 2002. I mean, we really worked hard, and I'll tell you how we did it, okay? We had done the conceptualization on using history, and we were going to do it for stem cell research between the British and the U.S., and then 9/11 happened. And so we said, oh, we don't want to do that. We threw that out. All the newspapers we collected and all the documents, and we worked on 9/11. We just, in other words, 9/11 forced us to go look at another event to compare other than stem cell research. And so what we found, we thought that we would find more historical references the further out. If you drop a pebble in the water, then it would spread out, and there would be more historical references later. Well, we didn't find that because the stories that were later were actually on recovery. What do we do about it? Do we go to war immediately? You know, those kind of stories predominated, not, you know, the history of it. That was one thing. We found for context previous bombings, okay? We found for context previous bombings having to do with the bombing of the carrier Cold in 2000, of the Kenya and the Tanzania embassy in 1998, the Pan Am flying over Lockerbie, that particular bombing. We found references to the bombing of Oklahoma City Government Center. We found the bombing of the world earlier, 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. And then, interesting enough, we found references to actually to Pearl Harbor. And the British, some of the British writers chided people for using Pearl Harbor as an analogy, as a comparison, because they said, sure, they had kamikaze pilots, but we already knew we were really having to face Japan and the buildup and the controversy there. So those were some of the context type things. U.S. newspapers pushed nostalgia. Remember the Portraits of Grief? The obituaries, obituary after obituary, and recollections. We found, as I mentioned, these analogies. Actually, the shock to the nation as the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that was something that was referred to. Of course, the Vietnam War, Gulf of Tonkin, the Persian Gulf War, and Pearl Harbor. Where, this was a shocking part, where the event occurred was more important than the British writing about it. We thought the British would talk about their experience in Afghanistan. No. We thought the British would talk about their experiences with terrorists like the Northern Ireland. No. They didn't. They talked about us. So where the event occurred was more important than the source, than the newspaper and the newspaper coverage. One thing I think this points out is what you could do, okay, for research. And here's something else we did. I did this with another student, PhD student, Lim, and we were looking at conflicts with Korea in cartoons. Not just the Korean War from 1950 to 53, oops, but also in 1968, the Pueblo, remember reading about the Pueblo in your history? The gunboat was captured by the North Koreans in January of 1968. They held it, Captain Brooker and the crew, they held them until December before they let them go. And so we found actually references, symbols used in these cartoons. In the last one, 1976, 3 officers were killed at the DMZ on the bridge of no return because the Americans, or the United Nations group, went over to cut down this poplar tree that obscured their view, and North Koreans killed 3 officers, okay? It became a real big issue. So in Communication the Quick, by using cartoons, we looked at symbols. We looked at how symbols used history, and what were those symbols. Early on, they were World War II symbols of the swastika and Hitler is evil, of Stalin and the hammer and sickle. In 1968, we got away in the in these 10 newspapers from using those symbols to mostly USSR symbols, okay, not World War II. And by 1976, in looking at the newspapers for historical references in their cartoons, we didn't find any references to USSR and to the Nazis in Germany from World War II. It was all muddied on the symbols, like a devil. In other words, there wasn't a clear-cut symbol by that shorter instance in 1976. Here's some other content studies we've done. One is, this was a qualitative content analysis looking at the immigration arguments that Congress was debating in 1993. Believe it or not, we've been arguing about immigration forever, I think. But in 1993, the argument was a proposal to have permanent partners, Immigration Act, okay? It died in committee. But there was a big flurry of articles in this country, and we looked on LexisNexis at the articles that were in Europe also. We thought that because so many Europeans had settled in this country, there might be some difference between the way Europeans covered immigration in the United States and the U.S. We didn't really find that. We did find an average of 2.5 historical references per story, regardless of region. That was interesting to us. We found it mostly in features and analysis, and again, it was U.S.-centric. It ignored the European problems, and they were having tremendous problems in '93 with immigration too. They ignored that, they just talked about ours. And then this last one, the Beijing Olympics. The past is but a prologue. We looked in the month of August 2007 was the auto ban. Remember that? The auto ban to test getting rid of pollution in Beijing, and they stopped the autos from going into the heart of the city. And so this was covered, and we looked at it in LexisNexis. And another content analysis, we found 55% of the stories used historical references. We found that countries outside of Asia used 71% used historical references in their stories. These are stories more than 3 lines. And the Asian countries almost used none. Now this could be our sample because we used English stories in LexisNexis. And if we've been able to read Chinese and all that, and Korean and Japanese, we might have found something else, but we didn't. We only used the English stories. We found an average of 3.9 historical references per story in the British newspapers, and 2.4 in certainly in the U.S. Now, the British, we know from textbooks, use essay-type journalists. So essay-type journalists is going to lend itself to historical references. And lastly, I'm going to show you a couple of others. This is taking a historian and saying, yes, you too can do an experiment. But only with great help, okay? And so Glenn Leshner, maybe some of you know him, and Anna Kononova, what we did is we wanted to do, does it make any difference? Does it have any kind of effect to use historical references? And we were really looking at credibility, 3 dependent variables, credibility, newsworthiness, and understanding the news. And because of the last study we'll show you, because we've been so ripped to pieces for using students, we got a grant, we got adults from Columbia, Missouri, and those were our subjects, okay? Now here's the problem. Those subjects demographically are not true. Everybody had at least 1 degree in college out of our subjects, okay? They were already knowledgeable about the election. This was done in 2008. They were already, they already kept up with the news a lot. And the only difference we found by using historical references were actually on credibility with local, you can see it right here, with local stories. That was the only difference we found. We were really disappointed. And then here's the one we really got ripped on, okay, which is using students and having students looking to see if historical references increased political knowledge, political attitude, or perceived importance. And the only thing we found was on perceived importance, okay, in that particular study. Well, those are the historical references studies. And now I am working as an outgrowth of that, another kind of effect, to look at change over time for involving a reputation. Reputations being made by public communication, more than just journalism and magazines, but textbooks and geographies and songs and music and paintings. And this constructed, taking from the sociologist, a social construction of shared beliefs about ability or achievements of a person. So I'm looking at various members of the core of discovery to discover that. And I've published several related things on this. It's another long-term study working on for years. And the first one was in Journalism Mass Communication Quarterly in winter of 2003, looking at the hero concept. And I mean, when Lewis and Clark and the men came back, Chicago, didn't come back with them to St. Louis, but when they came back, this was an era in which you didn't call people living heroes. You do that. Heroes were those classical figures of a long begone time in 1806, okay? You didn't call them heroes, but we did find it in poetry. And the poetry was published in the newspapers and the magazines. So we looked at the hero response. Then a previous study had done on heroes, actually with Janice Hume, on the rise of the human interest story. That's related. And then I did 2 book chapters for other people on public perception. What do we already know about reputation? We know Captain Lewis became governor of Louisiana Territory. We know he died of mysterious circumstances. We know that Captain Clark did not return with Lewis and some of the other men to Washington as the president wanted. Then he went to Indiana, so he wasn't there when they returned. We know he became the governor of Missouri Territory after Lewis died, and that he was superintendent of Indian Affairs. We know Patrick Gass beat everyone in publishing journals. And Patrick Gass lived till he was 90-something years old and married again. He outlived 3 or 4 wives, and then married again when he was almost 90 and had another couple children, put it that way. And we know that Sacagawea did not return to St. Louis. She's mentioned in the journals, okay? People have a hard time spelling her name. But we don't get any other mention of her, and I've already found that she is mentioned in a few textbooks in the 1820s. We know York, Clark Slade, is mentioned in the journals. Nothing. He's invisible also when they return to St. Louis. And we know that John Coulter is known more as a mountain man than a member of the Corps of Discovery or the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I remember as a kid reading in the textbooks about Coulter escaping the Blackfeet and being told to run naked. He did. He ran 30 miles to a fort and survived, okay? Well, those kind of stories were part of this legend of Coulter. Coulter died by the 18-teens and unfortunately died in a little town in Missouri in which there's no newspaper, so there's no obituary. So I don't know what they said right then. So here's what we know. I still have a lot to find out, and I'm actually giving a colloquium just on one person, Sacagawea, at the end of October. The American Indian Center asked me if I would just talk about the evolving of her reputation. And we do know, here was a newspaper citation, an Indian woman. This is when the first group of explorers were sent back from Fort Panda to St. Louis, and their letter to the president, they said there was an Indian woman who might know the way. No name, nothing. And then the Lewis and Clark exposition in Portland, Oregon, Susan B. Anthony comes in and said, this is the greatest American heroine. We're talking about Sacagawea, and there was a statue there for pointing, and so we know that. So in essence, what I've tried to do today is give you an overview of my research and also show you where I'm going now with this new study, and I'd be interested in your comments. Okay, Doug?
You know your comment about Father Coughlin? I wonder if he didn't have greater influence than you give him.
Than who?
Than you give him. Because Roosevelt was afraid of him politically.
Well, he was also afraid of others. For instance, not just Father Coughlin, but Huey P. Long before he was assassinated. And certainly Dr. Townsend had a huge following on the West Coast. And actually Father Coughlin, who went so far and seemed to sympathize to some degree with Nazis, was stopped by the diocese out of Detroit, and his radio program was stopped. So there was a control there. And I think that, actually I remember coming across that someone in the White House had talked to the diocese about Father Coughlin. But you're right, I think there's a new book that came out about 2 or 3 years ago on Father Coughlin. There's a new study on that. Yeah.
I was surprised you kind of, I find it quite remarkable that you as a historian were doing experiments. That's fabulous.
That was fun.
Yeah, very cool. And
I get no respect.
yeah, that's very exciting that you took it there and then you were looking like, does this make any difference? And I was surprised you kind of minimized your findings there, because I thought that's interesting that the historical reference did improve credibility in the local news, and if I was listening correctly, and the perceived importance of the story. I think that's interesting, isn't it? Doesn't it? So it's lending credibility and importance.
We thought it was really important, and we were really excited about it, and we submitted it to ICA and AEJ, and we got ripped. They really ripped. Not ICA. ICA took the credibility, the one I did with Glenn Leschner and Anna. They took that one, but they really ripped us.
Now, on what grounds? Why? What's the problem?
Well, first of all, that in the first study, or in the study we did that actually found importance, they said students don't read newspapers. We did mock-ups of newspaper articles, and we had the same headline, the same length, but we would put historical phrases in the story, the same gist of the story, but we would do historical phrases. And they said, oh, well, students don't care about political news, and they don't read newspapers, and this is, why did you do this study? I mean, in other words, this is
Can you
stupid.
back up to that slide? Can
Yes.
you go back to that
Sure, I
slide?
will.
I had the same impression that Jay did. Basically, what you have is a framed versus an unframed event. I mean, it made a difference if you frame it. If you don't frame it, it didn't. I mean, there's some level there deeper than what you're indicating. The message comes in this type is unframed. When you begin to put historical reference in it, it reframes it, and they pick it up. Pretty interesting, actually.
And then that was the first one. Here's the second study we get, okay, we'll get adults, we apply for a grant, we'll get people who aren't students who read newspapers, we did check that, So we were pretty discouraged by the response, yes.
Where did you get these comments? Follow up on what James said. Where did you get these comments that you got ripped?
Well, from the evaluators, when we submitted them,
No, that's all. With journal, for example.
oh, it wasn't a journal, we haven't sent it out yet.
Okay. Yeah, I just think you got bad reviewers, so I think.
Oh, there aren't such things. Come on.
I've had some.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, maybe, that's encouraging. Maybe we should go ahead and try to get these published.
Then, it was really different in terms of, because I think your design looks a lot more complex than you make it out to be.
Oh, it was very complex,
So I
because,
think that's.
look at that, we had two kind, local, national, in this study. We had with or without historical references. We had three independent variables, and then we had four different types of takes on the historical references or not that we gave the subject. So we had, we really, you can't believe how much work it was ahead of time to do this, yeah.
Well, did you have it in the history division?
Are you kidding? No. No.
I'm just saying, that would have been a sure to say.
Oh, yeah, no, we knew better than that. We didn't put it in the history division. We put this in political communication. And this one, and they did take it, okay, in political communication. This one, okay, we turned down by both AJ and ICA. I think we also put it in political, okay. Political for ICA, and then maybe mass media and society for the other one. Or maybe it was newspaper, okay, because we use newspaper articles, but they ripped us on. So, I mean, it's not just grad students who get discouraged with negative reviews, faculty do too, okay? So, we're still working on this, okay, we're still working on this. And I would, excuse me, 10 years. Well, 10 years on that journalism mass communication monograph, and then it wins an award. Let me point out, here's some good, I would encourage you, this is wide open, think about it. You could do sports stories, how sports stories use history. And why? Is it to legitimatize a person? Is it to place an athlete? I mean, this would be a great study. I'm at the ebb of my career, so here's a chance for you to carry on this, okay? And also the process. I think we need to know more about the process of choosing kinds of context. We don't know that. That would really be good. So here are some different studies done on not just using history, but also on news process, and then this last one. Let me say something about this last one. Margaret Macmillan, after I read that, I thought, God, I don't know if I want to ever read history. I mean, she is so rips the history and how they misuse it. But then I heard something this week, and perhaps you remember hearing it, which is Newt Gingrich and, who is it, Daniel, Lasula, both said that Barack Obama is really influenced by he has a big influence of colonialism taken from his father. And so here's a use of history, trying to understand a particular figure and blaming it on his father without knowing that his father was from a part of Kenya that was accepting of what had gone on, and that they were in independence when his father was an adult. It's a misuse of history. It's a misuse also, considering that Barack Obama hardly knew his father until he was an adult. So I think one thing I would like to see is journalists correct the misuses of history. I mean, we had someone about, 6 weeks ago say that if you let the tax cuts expire, it's like the Nazis marching into Poland. Well, that's a misuse of history. I mean, and we need to have journalists to be able to correct that, or at least to make some comment about it. So I wanted to point out that. And then here's some citations on reputation, if you're interested in doing anything on fame and renown. We have a lot of people in public relations who do a lot on repairing a reputation and so forth. But these are more historical kind of studies, except the first one. And the other three, Lang and Lang, the etched in memory, they were here at the Humanities Center when they worked on that. And really, I love the way they used reputation in following etchers of the 19th century. So, anything else?
I just had a question, actually two. One, some of the research that you presented is very interesting, and a lot of it is based on newspapers. Have you had anybody look at broadcast content? For example, television news, or better still, broadcast on NPR, like a news story,
Right.
Which is on radio.
Okay. The studies that we did, and maybe just because of the ease of trying to do a content study, we use magazines and newspapers. But your idea is fabulous, and notice I used that little snippet on the third party here in the state of North Carolina. And I think that would be something really good to do. The case with Newt Gingrich and Daniel Masula's comment about Barack Obama was corrected last night on NPR. It was just taken verbatim, and other news, broadcast news, but NPR corrected it.
But I understand broadcast media are fleeting, but you could get the transcript. I mean, do you think by analyzing the transcript it would take away from researching historical reference?
I think you could do it, and I would welcome you to do it. Okay, or have students do it, because I think this would tell us a lot. The same way with the internet news. I mean, it would really be good to do this with internet news. Yeah.
Back to the experiment, I was actually wondering, did you have any measures of like the participants' historical knowledge to compare?
We did it pre and post test.
Okay.
We did do that.
You're talking about the misuses of history, and I guess I just can't help but wonder, like, if history is misused, wouldn't that lower credibility?
It certainly would. It would. And maybe they thought we were, especially on national news, that we were biasing the story, and that's why it's uncredible. I mean, we did think of that, like, why did this happen? So we did think of that. Anything else? Yes. Okay.
Has anybody looked at the trends of reporters researching articles, like on the local level, how much research they do?
Not that I know of, but does anybody else know of? How much time you have, certainly. This is why I'm saying if you really demand your undergrads know history, they won't have to read. I mean, they'll at least know to quickly check or something. They'll think that
some
way.
research in that 9/11 article that considered what was a typical U.S. education for journalists versus UK, and UK have much more history as a requirement in their curriculum versus US.
I was talking to the Park librarian about the fact that a lot of newspaper librarians, libraries are just dying out. And they're just ditching old collections that are not digitized. So the history sort of stops at the point where the digital collection begins and all the paper stuff. All that history is erased.
Absolutely. You know, and maybe your press associations in different states should fund that. That's what we've been doing, having our press association help digitizing it.
You think any kind of scholarship would be possible without historical reference? Any kind?
Well, I think we use it to place our own scholarship. What's been done before, how did we fit in it? In other words, we do that as part of our lit review or for
You
twice.
do it as a physical, social science,
Right, but I'm trying to raise awareness here to the importance of that, and also the importance of looking at history and news stories. If I don't do anything else today, but to make you notice when you listen to the news or watch it or access it on the internet, how is history used? How is history used? If I've done that, then I feel really good. Thank you.